my work before the meltdown was primarily academic. Of course, I had just started a few years prior a lab, sort of a research group at Princeton that was working on different material strategies around robotics and things like that. But it was really sort of after the meltdown that the work started to matter to other people. A few things shifted. Of course, we had the beginning of reparations really starting to happen. First, because people could just take their data, right? So, I mean, the bank statements, the titles, the debt, all of that getting scrambled. But for me, the shift, what really changed, at least in my work and in architecture, was when people started coding. And I think people picked up the coding skills in order to sort the data packets, in order to do their own work in reparations, to take basically the algorithms that they were given in reparations and to do other things with them. It had been in Congress, put before Congress in the early 2000s. No one ever thought it was going to happen. But for Black Americans and those in the Caribbean, the data scrambling really became the beginning of reparations seeming like it could be possible. Because for the first time, no one knew what they were worth. No one knew how much money they had in the bank. And so it was possible politically to say, well, let's reset this in a way that's actually fair, right? Taking into consideration not just the 2 years of everyone's data being scrambled, but the past 200 years. And so that's when you started to see Oakland, Atlanta, New Orleans, for the first time becoming some of the wealthiest cities in the US. And of course you saw in New York, Harlem becoming the wealthiest neighborhood. But it was really sort of out of that moment of everyone's data packets and sort of asset histories being scrambled and then having to resolve the algorithms to unscramble, that the reparations movement actually finally figued out how to change the economy in the U.S. And I guess it was maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where my clients started to really come from people who already knew how to code. People who had been not necessarily building their own ways of building, but figuring out in code how to change the neighborhoods that they were living in and working in. So the combination of the money from reparations, the scrambled data packets, people coding, that's where the work that I had been doing really shifted from being academic work. And I think it's true for a lot of people, obviously, it's not just me. But from my vantage point, it was in Brooklyn, it was in Oakland, it was in New Orleans. Those were the places where the work that I had cared about that was academic started to actually change neighborhoods.
This transition towards digital literacy happened through this idea of universal learning, which means it was not like this old pedagogic way of doing things where they would tell you what to do step by step, like an algorithm, you just follow steps and you get your solution. It was more about being exposed to complex things that at first you don't understand, but by some kind of iterative process, by being exposed over and over and over and over by certain kind of concepts, you can start detecting patterns of how these things relates to one another. So it's very similar to learning a natural language. When you're learning how to speak, your parents don't tell you that this is the subject and this is the verb and this is a predicate, etc. You just listen, you see, and you connect what you see and what you hear, and you see that there are relationships that remain.
With the necessity to invent and reinvent processes, and with the idea that methods they come from bottom up. You also have to constantly learn. Like when there is an issue that I'm confronted with, and the best solution is in number, I will have to update myself and find out the quantitative methods that are needed for me, for this particular group I'm working with or within, and for the problem that we're dealing with. So it's a constant and intrinsic form of learning that characterizes work life these days, but also private life, because what is actually the difference?
That's been one of the most remarkable changes, more than any of the things on the ground, is the process that we have now, where we demand these constant changes in how we organize ourselves and the basis of legitimacy in our societies.
Bureaucracy is not something that, is requested from above, and then there's like this middle layer that comes up with forms and regulations, and then there's people that are confronted with it. It's about the fact that we do all of these things together and in a very local and situated manner.
In a decentralized society, which we could call self-organized, we function under the form of contracts. And these contracts are like models in a way in which they are being continuously re-articulated. They are not permanent. The model on its own, it's re-articulated, taking into consideration the collective, but also the individual at the same time, creating a bridge between both. And it gives certain answers, or it's collapse depending on the question that it's being asked for. Every time that the contract or the model collapses, a new contract will appear, because the collective is being reinvented all the time. It is enough that one individual within the collective changes, regardless how big or small it becomes, a new model will be necessary in order to consider it, because everything is connected with everything, and whatever answer we get or we define, it's always in relationship to a whole. And what we call a community doesn't have a specific size. It depends on the question which is being made. So the context is always essential to the constitution of the model. Let's say that is the first step, because you always need to define a context within which you want to play. So we create contracts for a whole planet that consider everything at once and at the same time the individual, or for a very small community that has something to share or something in common to discuss.
Obviously, there's some massive achievement that we've managed in the last years to find some approach that has been able to decentralize both control of resources, but also to localize and in a way find new localities for that kind of approach to resources. So in many ways we can understand that also in the context of a kind of distributed focus toward building and developing what of course we also call the trust society, what we've also looked at in terms of a society based on new sets of protocols that have been developed only in this last decade, where we see new urban protocols that have managed in different ways to find new structurings of how we see the world around us, new structures of understanding layers that are an entirely new set of layers from what we understood 10 or even 20 years ago.
Today, US-American rapper and music producer Jay-Z announced to leave his home in Bel Air. The 30,000 square meter house will be provided as a residency for young economical talents, as a place for residency and work. Carter and his wife Beyoncé moved to France as they are in the process of finding ways to open source their champagne company Armand de Brignac.